Hi, I'm Rigger. This is You Are Right, and welcome back to RWBY Runs. Before we get started, be sure to like the video if you like it, share it if you think others would like it, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and subscribe if you want to see more. Where we last left the story, White had completed her time at Schnee Manor and will be leaving as per the show as usual. And the others are not in great shape. After being stung, Ruby has gone downhill very quickly. They were smart about it, having her move as little as possible and making the best time they could. But most likely due to her much smaller size, she's very quickly deteriorated, and Ruby has hit the point where Crow could not delay giving her help anymore, giving the others the instruction to head to the destroyed Kurogiri so they could find shelter, and so he'd know where to send help back to. Crow then took off as a bird straight towards Mistral, Pyrrha the only one seeing him transform and leave. Now Pyrrha, Nora, and a quite uncomfortable Ren have to head for the town, with Ruby on a stretcher as her condition continues to worsen. We rejoin the team at the entrance to the city itself. The bleak destruction of the town is a confronting sight to anyone, but to Ren, simply devastating. Pyrrha has the front of the stretcher and Nora the back, while Ren trudges with his head down, barely able to look up at the town around him. We don't know how long we'll need to be here. We should find shelter. It's wrecked, but a lot of buildings are still standing. We should find one with a bed for Ruby while we wait. Pyrrha just nods, looking around for somewhere suitable, and Ren isn't reactive. After a few moments, Pyrrha finally speaks. If they do send ships, they'll need to land, so near the square would be best. She nods in a direction to one of the better buildings by the square, just what was once a small house perhaps. The doors offer no resistance, and they take Ruby inside, finding a dusty old bed. They take the top layer of covers off it so it's somewhat cleaner underneath and lay Ruby on it. She is looking terrible. Cold sweat is running down her face. She has bouts of shivering. She stopped being coherent a while ago. Outside of coughing and spluttering, just little noises of grunts and groans and slight fluttering of her eyelids indicate she's conscious at all. So, now what? I guess we just wait and hope. If we're looking for hope, we came to the wrong place. Ren, who was being standoffish by the door, turns on his heel and walks outside again. Nora looks to go after him, but pauses. Go. It's alright. I'll stay with Ruby. And Pyrrha turns back, kneeling beside Ruby's bedside and holding her unresponsive hand. Nora follows Ren outside. Hey! Ren, who was basically sort of walking in circles in place, stops. Look, I know I don't like being here either, but we need to protect Ruby. Crow's coming. But that guy could be following us. Just, with any luck, we won't be here for long. Okay? Ren rubs his hands over his face and takes a deep breath. I just need to clear my head. He looks around a little bit. I'm going for a walk. I won't be long. But didn't you hear? Yes, Nora. I'll be careful. Promise. I just need some time. I won't go far, and you stay and protect Ruby. As long as you're sure. Ren nods reassuringly, and wanders off across the square as Nora moves back to the house, but elects to stand guard at the front door, watching the town. Ren wanders, not really thinking where he's going, yet naturally he still remembers the town layout as if it were second nature. He roams, having flashbacks to his time in childhood, where he met Nora, and finally even to his home. The memories play back for him. He actually takes a step back as the horrid idea that his mother's remains could still be in that rubble enters his mind, and he moves on. He wanders past the now dry stream. His horrible little trip down memory lane is confronting, but he seems to be coming to terms with being here slowly. He stares at the spot where he and Nora hid. He could still hear that horrible sound of those hooves clopping off the cobblestone. His memory played it for him as if it were real. It was so convincing. That horrid sound. Clip-clop, clip-clop, clip-clop. It was burned into his mind. The huff of that beast's breath. Then Ren froze. His eyes go wide. It did sound very real. Very real. And with horror, Ren slowly forces his body to turn. It's almost as if his body itself won't respond to him for a moment, but eventually he does indeed manage to look behind him, and there stood the creature of his nightmares, So lost in his horrific memories, it had appeared and approached far too close for comfort. There is panic in Ren's eyes. Pyrrha is still kneeling beside RWBY, holding her hand. I'm sorry. I should have done something, or not been there, or I don't know, but he was aiming for me. Please, don't leave us. She has her head basically pressed into the edge of the mattress as she speaks. Bang! There's an explosion from outside. Pyrrha leaps to her feet in panic and sprints out to meet Nora by the front door. Across the square, behind a line of houses, there's smoke and debris from a building collapsing. Running across the square is Ren. We can see he's cloaked with his semblance, but he stops and turns back towards the explosion halfway across the square. He yells back to them, "It's looking for me! Come out here, quick! We can't lead it to RWBY!" Nora and Pyrrha look at each other, but have no other choice and nod, running away from the house so the threat wouldn't sense them and attack where RWBY was staying. They instead join Ren in the square, and he decloaks to conserve aura as he can't hide everyone forever. With weapons drawn, Pyrrha simply drops her cloak, and the three wait. And slowly, from around the corner, comes the horrific nucklavee, which roars at the small assembly. Seeing the fear on Ren's face, Pyrrha defaults to a leadership position and snaps into trying to problem solve. She brings Jaune's shield up, extends her spear, and runs in, hoping to use her shield to block frontal attacks and stab at it to keep its attention. Nora and Ren both decide to start opening fire. Both plans end poorly, as the nucklavee quickly uses its arms to reach and slap Nora and Ren across the ground, whilst Pyrrha is quickly being overwhelmed by the kicking horse, forcing her back. It's too much for her one small shield to handle, especially when the horse can maintain its concentration on her even though the rider is distracted with those shooting at it. She tries in vain to stab it in the legs, seemingly only to succeed in angering it. Backing off, she too resorts to shooting at it with her rifle, trying to keep its attention split. It charges her, which she rolls to avoid, but gets grabbed and thrown into Nora, who'd begun to charge in with her hammer as well, and they collide in a heap. They are making very little impact, and very quickly taking a lot of damage. What's the plan? She looks between a seemingly quite lost Pyrrha and a seething with rage Ren. Anyone? Pyrrha is starting to breathe a little heavy as she gets up. I don't know. Ren looks at them both, and takes off running in an arc and firing on it again, seemingly just to do something. At this, Pyrrha signals for Nora to circle the other way. We may as well spread out. She does so, also firing on it. But even with all their ammo, it's really just causing the beast to be impacted, but not really affected. Pyrrha transforms her weapon back to a spear and takes aim while the beast is being jostled around, and at the opportune moment fires a dust-assisted spear throw, which nails the horse head in an eye and it flails wildly, spinning in place and kicking its hooves around, one of which, with the spin, clips Ren and he was sent sprawling backwards. Pyrrha is already running in, needing to close the distance. She uses her polarity to call her spear back successfully, and lines up a second throw. Almost with frustration, the nucklavee gathers itself and screams, causing all of them to freeze and cover their ears, at which point Pyrrha is suddenly grabbed, but rather than being thrown around or smashed into the ground, she is instead held as the fingers wrap around her. The second hand snatches up Nora's ankle, picks her up and slams her hard into the ground, and then throws her bodily across the courtyard where she heavily impacts and dents the wall of a building, her aura shattering as she falls to the ground and slumps over. But Pyrrha, who seems to have pissed it off in particular, is still in its hand, its fingers closed around her, pinning her arms to her sides. Her spear clatters to the ground and she's raised up and squeezed. It's clear immense pressure is being put on her. Her aura even crackles in place as it attempts to hold back the crush on her body. Ren has slowly picked himself back up, but hears Pyrrha yell in pain as she is being crushed, and sees Nora on the ground impacted by a wall across the square, not knowing if she's even alive. With anger, he sets his eyes and charges in. "Ren, wait!" Pyrrha yells in warning, But just like when he said the same thing to her with Tyrion, he only glances at her for a moment before committing and running in anyway. He charges in, yelling and firing. He closes the gap to it and starts slashing at its front legs. He dodges and rolls away from the biting horse head. But it doesn't last long, and eventually he comes up from a roll and doesn't see a hoof flying in as a kick clips him under the chin and he's sent skidding back. Before he can regain his composure, the beast charges over him, trampling him underfoot as he is stomped painfully into the ground, bouncing off the concrete again and left in the dust. This whole encounter did, however, cause it to drop Pyrrha in order to try and kill Ren. A very beat-up Ren is left on the ground, and the beast turns to trample over him again. Pyrrha crawls to her weapon, transforms it to the rifle, and takes a pot shot. It works, hitting the rider in the head, and the nucklavee skids to a stop before hitting Ren again and turns to face her. It roars at her, picks up Ren's body, and hurls him through the air, leaving his guns behind. He skips along the hard cobblestone ground like a stone over a lake, his aura shattering and landing near Nora across the square. Pyrrha struggles to her feet. It's hopeless. She starts backing away towards Ren and Nora, stumbling backwards, taking a shot at the horse, which barely registers. She's shaky, beat up, and at this point the nucklavee is simply bearing down on her, walking forward menacingly, seeing its weakened prey slowly losing hope. The horse rears again and kicks at her. She gets her shield up but gets kicked back down onto the ground near the others. The three of them now basically up against a building in the square, either side of a doorway. Nora and Ren are groaning, barely awake and struggling to get up. Pyrrha looks across at her team, tears in her eyes. It seems that all three of them are moments away from facing their death. Pyrrha has somewhat crawled backwards across the ground, sliding back as far as she can until her shoulders hit the wall of the building. The beast pulls back its hand to deliver one last decisive blow to Pyrrha. She raises Jaune's shield up in front of her as one last line of defense. Preparing for impact, she turns her head away and braces. She hears a footstep, and another. Opening her eyes, she's looking at some black boots in a doorway. Looking up, they belong to RWBY. It turns out the building they were all basically thrown into was the one that RWBY was in. She's in the doorway. Similarly though, she looks on death's door. She can't stand up unassisted. She's leaning on the doorframe for support, nearly falling over. The beast, with hand back poised to strike, sees her and growls. We get a point of view from RWBY. She sees very fuzzy images of Nora crawling to hold Ren, who himself is struggling to even sit up, and Pyrrha, teary-eyed and beat up on the ground, holding Jaune's shield in front of herself and waiting to die. Through fluttering eyelids, she sees a glint of the hilt of Jaune's sword, still in place in the shield. Finally, RWBY sees the beast, its horrific face and burning eyes, and it throws its arm forward to deliver the killing strike. And there's a flash. The others are forced to cover their eyes. Pyrrha hears a roar, peeking over her shield as the air clears. She sees the beast is missing the arm that it had tried to strike with, and has retreated several feet as the rest of its body is similarly smoking, as if it's burning, and it's thrashing around in pain. Pyrrha looks to RWBY, who is totally out, slumps into the doorframe and pitches forward, landing on the ground hard with a thud and smacking her head off the stone as she lands. She is completely unconscious and not moving at all. RWBY! RWBY! Pyrrha gathers her up into a hug and moves her, sliding her back to sit her against the wall. Come on, RWBY, talk to me. RWBY? Pyrrha is shaking RWBY's shoulder, holding RWBY's face, looking for any kind of response. RWBY does exhale, ever so slightly, but nothing else. Heads up. Groaning, Ren gets to his feet and indicates across the square, pulling the knife from his boot and standing with Nora, both of whom are banged up. Pyrrha looks around, and the nucklavee is calming down and sizing them up again. Pyrrha turns away from RWBY, standing and joining her teammates shoulder to shoulder, with no hope of winning still, and raises their weapons. For what it's worth, I'm really sorry for everything. It's not your fault. I'm sorry too. The trio set their positions and wait for the last charge. The nucklavee snarls and charges in. The team are set, waiting, and shring! There's a roar as a silver streak comes through, and just like that, Crow is here, having sliced the nucklavee across the back and skidded to a halt on his feet off to the side, causing the beast to roar in pain and spin in place to face him. Where did he... And gunfire rings out as two airships are lowering down above them in the square, as in each a soldier appears at the door, an automatic rifle in hand and peppering the nucklavee from the sky. What is this thing? No idea, but we need to stop it and get RWBY help. RWBY? Crow now scans for his niece and spots her slumped over against the wall. During their quick exchange, the nucklavee had turned to roar at the low-hanging airships as well. They were peppering it with gunfire. In a moment of horror, Ren realizes, no, don't get so close. But it's too late as the nucklavee arm extends out and snatches one of the gunmen from the ship, flinging him across the sky and into the square behind a set of buildings with a sickening snapping sound ringing out, ending his life. This causes the airships to need to pull back up, out of range of his arms, but also quite out of range of the effective distance for their rifles, meaning they can no longer effectively help the team. Crow steps forward. Alright, with me, let's take this thing down. He gives some quick signals to the team and then confidently strides out as the others split off in different directions. nucklavee stares him down. What? You gonna stand there all day looking ugly? Or do you want a piece of me? The nucklavee roars and charges him, and Crow smirks. Now! And Nora comes running in from the side where she was hiding between two buildings, swinging for the fences at its back leg at its side, targeting the side where the arm was missing. Her hammer collides with it in an almighty hit that turns its knee joint inside out, immediately crippling its back leg. Suddenly going lame mid-run, it roars, but it gets hit and shot. We see the shots are coming from one of Ren's guns, but pulling back, it's actually Pyrrha holding it, who has moved across the square to its other side and is now shooting it out in the open. Come on! It takes the bait. Being the side that it still has an arm on, it extends it at her, trying to grab her. She brings up her shield in time. As its fingers close around the shield, she directs her shield hand downwards, and we see that she had polarity activated, and her spear has been hovering out of sight above her, and it shoots down and pins its arm to the ground. Her aura breaks, using the last of it on her semblance, but she grabs the spear and keeps that arm pinned down. With one back leg gone and one arm pinned, it feebly crawls to face Pyrrha, at which point there is another silver flash and Crow speeds past it with his scythe extended. One moment he is simply streaking past the horse's head, and the next moment the head is coming with him as he removes it from the body. This causes its front legs to totally give out and it crumples on its belly, at which point Ren slowly walks up to it, stares it in the face, says his words to himself, and removes the rider's head in one clean slash from his knife. Ren and Nora celebrate with a hug, but Pyrrha looks to RWBY, and Crow is already halfway there, sprinting over to her, waving the ships back down above them. Crow gathers RWBY up in his arms. The others collect their belongings, and they all hurry into the airships. From here, we move into the ending volume montage, but there is noticeable differences. Yang is heading out on a boat, Blake is considering what to do in Menagerie, and Weiss is paying off a pilot to smuggle her out. However, we see in Salem's camp that Tyrion has not come back yet, at all. Salem and the others are unaware of what's happened, but Cinder is still training to kill RWBY. Is Tyrion dead? Did he run away? Is he just delayed? We don't get the answer. He does not return this volume. Flying into Mistral is obviously a beautiful sight. Ren and Nora still share their hand-holding and lovely moment in the doorway of the ship, but we see Pyrrha stood between the pair of Ren and Nora, and the other group of Crow holding Ruby's hand in panic as she's out and being attended to on the ship's deck. Pyrrha is just standing alone between the two groups, looking unsure from one to the other. Having put her cloak back on and seeing Mistral come into view, she solemnly puts up her hood once more. There is no nicely worded letter home. Instead, we do not see Ruby in a comfortable bed in a house, but in a hospital bed. She's in some medical facility, unconscious in a room and on a drip. We see in the montage silent moments of Crow yelling at doctors behind closed doors, him sitting by her bedside, Ren and Nora sitting out in a waiting room. Finally, Crow is almost woken up as Pyrrha walks in. How is she? Crow sighs and nods. She'll be alright, but that was too close. Yeah. Why don't you have a break? I'll watch her. Crow seems like he's going to refuse, but sighs, nodding, getting up to free up the seat for Pyrrha. She sits down and takes Ruby's hand like Crow had as he walks to the door, but he stops. Thanks. Pyrrha looks up and then realizes he's not talking about taking over for him here. Crow is nearly nose to nose with the door, not wanting to show her his face, and he hunches slightly as faint tears well up in his eyes. He scrunches his eyes and blinks them away. Really? Thank you. Pyrrha. She looks conflicted, starting to say several things and stopping. Eventually, she just nods. No problem. He opens the door and leaves, walking past Nora and Ren. Nora is asleep on Ren's shoulder, but Crow gives them a nod of thanks as he passes. Pyrrha watches him go past them through the window of the hospital room, looking at her teammates before looking down, concerned. Later, we come back to the scene. It's darker out, and Pyrrha is lost in thought. Hey. Pyrrha looks up, and Ruby's eyes have opened by the tiniest fraction. Did we make it? Pyrrha sniffs back some tears, and a huge smile of relief breaks out on her face. Yes, we did. We made it, Ruby. We're in Mistral. Ruby weakly smiles. Good. After all of that, this Professor Lionheart guy had better be worth it. She chuckles weakly, and Pyrrha actually does, too. We pull out for the closing shot as Pyrrha leans in and hugs Ruby in the hospital bed. We then cut to some ominous juxtaposition as we see that Professor Lionheart having tea with a suited man with a mustache, Dr. Watts. Rather than the confusing time jump end scene, instead we simply also see Oscar arrive in Mistral after the credits. He looks up at the academy, all the way high on the cliff, where he can see it from the train station. The train leaves from behind him, leaving him to his future. I just hope you're right about all this, he seems to say to no one, and then walks into the city. And that's all for Volume 4. We have finished it now. Ruby and co did not escape unscathed. What's left of Team Juniper seems to be having issues. Crow saved the day, but also seems to be in a rough spot. Oscar has arrived to find his contact, and Tyrion never came home. Everyone else is on their set paths. And once again, we end the volume with Ruby banged up in bed, this time worse than before, although it wasn't her father and Crow that she woke up to this time, but instead, Pyrrha. And that's where we close it off. What will happen when all these paths converge now? Until then, my name is Rigger. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope I did alright.